Hello and welcome to the Somerville Alliance for Safe Streets Summit. We appreciate everybody taking the time today to join us to discuss this important issue. We're also delighted to have many city officials and state legislators with us this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. There's closed captioning available. You can find an external link in the chat. Oops. Our agenda today will be opening remarks, followed by a panel of community members and tied together in the closing remarks. Our alliance comprises volunteers from Somerville's community who bring together different concerns for our streets. Some common themes are safety, including concerns about driver behavior, equity and transportation options, streetscape vitality, and climate resilience. These are the same themes that emerged in the feedback we received from the signatories of our call to action. But in truth, we all care about multiple issues, and we find they're complementary because our streets can be all these things when we make the right changes. To introduce myself, I'm Stephanie Galeazzi. I'm concerned with safety. I'm also a mom thinking about climate change, equity for women, and I commute to Concord for work. Traffic safety is personal for me. My mother's brother was killed as a pedestrian in 1973. On my father's side, my uncle and my grandfather died in a crash 2 years later. When I met my husband, we realized this is something we share. His uncle was a passenger, having just picked up friends in Somerville when a drunk driver hit the car and killed him. Between me and my husband, we lost half our uncles to traffic deaths. You'll notice these are old pictures. These deaths happened in the decade before either of us were born. But we both grew up with this grief woven into the narratives of our families, these unnecessary and pointless deaths. And I can attest that their consequences still reverberate in our families today. And our awareness only heightened when we became parents to a son. I thought about my grandmothers who had raised my uncles and how they must have felt to lose them. This is a picture of my son today. He's pulled his underwear out of his pants to use it as a sheath for his sword. He loves playing hero, and in his stories, he always wins. But every once in a while, when we're navigating crosswalks and I'm repeating my regular warnings, he tells me he'll fight the cars. He's a hero, he says, and he'll win. And I have to remind him that we never play about cars. Cars are the leading cause of death for children in the United States. Our streets are getting more dangerous as cars get bigger and Google Maps and Waze direct drivers to cut through our neighborhoods. Nationally, pedestrian deaths are rising. This is played out in Somerville too, which we can see in the data. 4 pedestrians have died since 2019. But of course, the data doesn't capture the disrupted lives of the people killed or the consequences for the people left behind. Data doesn't capture how these losses will continue to reverberate in our community. Our alliance formed because we need to do more to prevent these losses. Our call to action has 3 core asks. Firstly, our streets should be safe. Street design should minimize risk to all users, whether they are driving, walking, using mobility devices such as wheelchairs and walkers, pushing a stroller, or riding a bicycle. Everyone should be able to get around safely. Here we see a picture of a pedestrian sign knocked over by a car, which doesn't bode well for the crosswalk. Secondly, our infrastructure, transit, and mobility investments should be made equitably to provide opportunities for everyone to move around reliably, regardless of their abilities and means of transportation. This includes ensuring that people with disabilities can access all parts of the city via genuinely accessible routes to all public buildings, transit stations, and civic amenities. We also should prioritize historically underserved neighborhoods. This picture is an example of infrastructure that is not being used equitably because it's prioritizing cars over sidewalk access. Finally, we recognize that our streets and sidewalks comprise nearly a quarter of Somerville's land. This is a precious civic asset. This land provides benefits for all residents. After assuring safety and equitable mobility, this space can also contribute to people-scale quality of life as they move through the streets, and to climate resilience, such as providing shade trees or permeable surfaces. Here's a picture of a Somerville street festival showing other options for streetscape use. The good news is that we're not fighting the city on these streetscape goals. They're stated over and over in city documents. The documents address diverse topics like climate change, Vision Zero, public space usage, and street reconstruction, but they're all complementary in their vision for our streetscapes. This is a vision the city has endorsed repeatedly. The city knows what is needed because it's sometimes getting done. Public transit will be hugely improved with the Green Line extension, and infrastructure is changing. However, we're still seeing major projects that don't meet these goals. As Somerville repaves or resurfaces our streetscapes, we have opportunities to implement these changes, opportunities that may not arise again for decades. Yet too often we have found the city prioritizes preserving the status quo of space dedicated to cars at the expense of the city's stated goals. The changes needed aren't just about budget. They're about how we use our limited public space and who benefits from it. Listed here are some notable disappointments for many different reasons, though the latter two are not yet finalized. We'll be paying close attention to any changes announced by the city, and we're ready to make sure that the mayor and city council follow through with commitments. We all stand to gain from increased safety, equitable mobility, and beneficial streetscape usage. We'll have real options to reduce car dependency in Somerville. Our alliance understands that cars have a role to play in our city. Most of us own and drive cars, but it doesn't make sense to reflexively prioritize space for single occupancy vehicles at the expense of expanding safe and reliable transportation options that will help people displace car trips. Then residents will be able to save money, get exercise, and waste less time in traffic. As a community, we'll have greater safety, mobility options that provide greater independence for people like children and the elderly who can't drive, less congested streets, cleaner air, improved public spaces, and climate change resilience to benefit future generations. Everyone can benefit from Somerville's goals, but it's up to the city to structure our streets in ways that make the better choices also the easier choices. So let's move forward. Our call to action has received over 400 signatures from Somerville's residents. At the end of the day, we're really lucky to live in a city that shares these values. Now we just have to make sure they're implemented. Next up, I'd like to introduce Joan Liu, who will moderate our community panel. Thank you.
Muted. Hi, everyone. My name is Joan, and I live in Ward 1, that's an area of Somerville between 93 and McGrath. I've been riding a bike off and on since I was a little kid to get to school, get around, or just for fun. And when I wasn't on a bicycle, I was actually taking Texas's public bus system. Now I cycle or walk around Somerville, especially during the pandemic. I have been threatened, tailgated, honked at on our streets. I have tripped, slid, walked into things on our sidewalk. And I've even showed up late to appointments or even job interviews because the bus or subway was running behind for one reason or another. And I really want something better. Unimaginative people always say that those of us who choose to be outside the car need to show a bit more personal responsibility, as if driving gets you a free pass from personal responsibility. What naysayers miss is that advocating for safer streets is advocating for others. We're advocating for choices that reduce the burden of personal responsibility for everyone. We don't expect drivers to show personal responsibility in shoveling the streets they drive on, and we're just asking for the city to help remove some of that burden from everyone else. We want the city to work for all of its residents and not shirk their responsibilities and promises to us, the other residents who don't drive. We've brought together a great panel of different voices we don't always hear, especially if you don't attend the right meetings or know the right people. They definitely aren't the only voices out there, just some of the people the city is letting down when we leave their safety up to personal responsibility. I'm going to ask the panelists to go around and introduce themselves and why they have signed on to SASS. So first off, we have Larry. Larry, please introduce yourself and tell us why you have signed on to SASS.
Cheers. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Joan. My name's Larry Yu. I live in the Davis Square area, and I'm active with the Climate Coalition of Somerville. And I point that out because climate is really a prime motivator for a lot of my behaviors. And I signed on to SASS because transportation is crucial to achieving our climate neutrality goals as a city. Street traffic represents about 30% of the city's carbon emissions. And I try to live up to those climate neutrality goals. And I go out of my way to get around the city without a car. And yet I still face a lot of barriers, and safety is one of those barriers that make it hard to do everything I'd like to do without getting in a car. So my experience has been that we're not really allowing residents to live into our sustainability values and achieve our climate goals. And so we have some work to do, Joan. That's why I've joined.
Great. Next we have Letitia. Letitia, will you introduce yourself and briefly tell us why you've signed on to SASS?
Hello, my name is Letitia Scott. I am the co-president of Clarendon Residents United here. I live in the Somerville Housing Authority here right off Alewife Brook Parkway in Somerville. So I'm part of Ward 7. And I signed on because I have been taking public transit for about 20 years, whether it's buses or trains. And outside of, the sidewalks maybe not being safe, for me, it's about the safety of getting from one side of Somerville to the other. I live on the very far end here in Somerville. Getting to the other side is difficult. The safety regarding whether or not our sidewalks are clear, or I see, one of my fellow citizens trying to get onto a bus with a wheelchair. I see all of this. I've seen everything in the last 15, 20 years. And so I just want to see improvements made for the safety for everyone here in Somerville.
Great, thank you. Next, I'll introduce Leanne. Leanne, will you briefly introduce yourself and also why you have signed on to SASS?
Hi, I'm Leanne Gerton, and safety and accessibility have been something I've cared about for a long time, but I was drawn to SASS in particular because it is so intersectional. A lot of advocacy groups will focus on a single demographic, so they'll address issues that matter to cyclists or to transit users or to parents with small children, but most of us don't fit neatly into a single box. And the ways that our different identities combine affect what we need from our streets. So for example, I come to this with the perspective of a disabled cyclist, and I often find that the issues that affect me don't come up because the disability side of that isn't the most important thing in the bike context, and the biking side of that isn't the most important thing in the disability context. So I'm really excited that SASS is bringing everyone together at the same table so we can have that opportunity to explore the unique issues that arise when different identities overlap.
Thank you. Next, we have Steph. Steph, will you briefly introduce yourself? He's calling in. And also, why have you signed on to SASS?
Yes, so my name is Steph Amon. I appreciate being here. It's a great opportunity to get our streets safer. Obviously, with everything that is going on right now, bringing this to attention is extremely important because we have a great opportunity of making a difference in Somerville. So thank you for having me aboard.
Great, thanks, Steph. And finally, we have Susan. Susan, will you briefly introduce yourself and why you have signed on to SASS?
Hi, I'm Susan McLucas. I've lived in Somerville for 36 years. I run the bicycle riding school where between me and my other teachers, we've taught about 5,000 people how to ride. Most of my students say they never want to ride on streets because they are afraid to share the space with cars because they're so narrow, which is too bad because that's how bicycling can really contribute to lowering pollution and congestion in a city. So I'm looking for a way to make the streets more welcoming to bicycle riders.
Great. So now I have some questions just to kind of bring out people's individual experiences. And so I'll start out with Larry. Larry, what are some connections between safety on our streets and sidewalks and climate that you think others aren't aware of?
Thanks, Joan. So I mean, reducing our emissions are going to mean nudging our culture toward more low carbon ways of getting around, and improving physical safety for other modes of transportation is a big part of nudging our culture. I should, this isn't going to be popular, but I should add that you know, keeping pedestrians safe from bikers is also part of safety from the pedestrian perspective. So I hope really everyone can be part of a culture change that's more accommodating for other kinds of transportation, making bus experiences better, for example. But you know all that. You were asking about things that you may not have been thinking about. So I'll highlight two things quickly. One is particulate emissions are coincident with carbon emissions from gas-powered vehicles, and we have a public health crisis along our highways because we have insufficient barriers from particulate emissions. So I mean, you probably don't want to be on the streets nearby our highways or nearby a lot of our state roads. So that is certainly one issue that is a safety issue that you may not be thinking of, because it's the air that we breathe. But here's another issue too. Somerville is a walkable city in the spring and fall. Relatively, it's somewhat walkable in the winter, at least when sidewalks are cleared. And I think more emphasis does need to be placed on clearing sidewalks of snow. But summer is tough, and I don't think we always think about vulnerable pedestrians in summer. Right now, we have 11 days on average in the summer that are over 90 degrees, and those make it tough conditions to be out on the street. That's projected to potentially reach 90 days over 90 degrees by 2070. 90 days over 90 degrees. That's basically the entire summer, uncomfortable to be out on the street. So I think from a safety perspective, also, we need to be thinking about tree canopies to allow people to be out on the street. I think we need to be thinking about bus shelters for heat island effects. I mean, if you can imagine some of our big thoroughfares like Beacon Street and Somerville Ave and Highland Ave and Broadway, and imagine them as tree-lined streets with bus shelters, maybe put green roofs on those bus shelters. I mean, I think we can make the city more comfortable and safer from the heat perspective, and make it more beautiful at the same time. So that's what I would look at.
Great. So based on that, what do you think the #1 change the city could implement to make our city more climate resilient?
Yeah, so I mean, we talk about a lot about the surface level, about bus lanes and bike lanes and sidewalks and what we're going to do with them, and you know, so I've highlighted a couple things above the surface level: tree canopies and bus shelters. We also need to think about what goes on below the surface level, and I would love every streetscape project to not only focus on making it easier to get around with other modes of transportation, but also to improve our climate infrastructure every time we tear up a street and work on it. So build back better every time. And there are two things that you might think about there. One is we have to deal with leaks in our gas infrastructure that is underneath our streets and our sidewalks. Natural gas is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. It's also dangerous, as we saw in Lawrence and in North Andover a couple years ago. So every time we tear up those streets, let's fix the gas infrastructure that we have down there so that it isn't leaking, because we do have leaks, active leaks, very active leaks all across Somerville. And then the second piece is when you tear up a street, is to think about how to deal with stormwater better, using things like bioswales and underground cisterns and, you know, other kinds of green infrastructure to capture water, keep them out of our sewer system, which will just flow into the Mystic, and keep them out of our basements, and help us deal with bigger storms in the future. So I think we need to think about the street level as well as above the street level, and then below as well. And that's a harder part to deal with.
Great. And as a member of the Climate Coalition of Somerville, what are common concerns that other members bring about our streets?
We talk a lot about EV cars and infrastructure and electric buses and things like that, and transforming the modes of transportation into low carbon modes of transportation. We talk a little less about the behavioral stuff, and there are obviously big opportunities to get more people into electric cars, battery electric cars, and into buses, but you know, those are also big spend, and so we recognize that that's not really an equitable solution, and we need to deal more on the behavioral side as well.
Great, thank you. Letitia, now we'll get your perspective. What are things about using our streets and sidewalks that are dangerous for you, but you think are overlooked by others?
Oh, it can be something as small as sidewalks that are falling apart. I have literally hurt my foot walking. I mean, swollen up for a whole weekend because of that. I think some places are a little scary, like in Davis Square. I feel like the brick, if they don't clear it and put salt, I'm afraid of falling. I really am. I think one of the other things is if you're going to have to take the bus at night or a train, more lights. I don't feel like there's enough lights, and I would have to agree. We need more space coverings at bus stops. I feel like there's just not enough of that. You feel a little safer at night when you're in one of those. And maybe, I know this could be costly, but even putting in like more security cameras. It all just would make you feel a little bit safer. You never know who has to go out with, their child. It just happens that way sometimes. I think reaching out to the community to gain support locally would help with understanding certain people's issues, because like I said, if you have children, sometimes these bus stops, they don't allow you to get onto a bus easily with something. And so if we had something that more infrastructure, I think infrastructure in general needs to be there, because sometimes it just, even that doesn't make you feel safe. Better overpasses, like more lights. We have children everywhere where I live, and it can get a little bit crazy. So, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds rough. And what is the #1 change the city could implement to make getting around safer for you?
I think, yeah, I think for me, I'm good with technology. I have GPS on my phone, but I think if we put up more signals for when buses are coming, when they're leaving, so people don't have to wait out there that long. I think if people didn't have to wait more than maybe 5 minutes, they would feel a lot better about it. Making sure that we maybe work more with the MBTA to have more transportation and better access to certain parts of the city, because I don't feel safe going in certain areas. It's just because, one, it's not lit well, it's the ground isn't safe, their buses aren't there. You don't want to wait a half hour or more. And I've had to do that a lot over the years. So I try to avoid that as much as possible. But I know most people are not technology savvy like me, so I can plan it with my GPS, but I know a lot of people can't, especially our older citizens. Let's not have them out there where they can get hurt and someone can hurt them. And so I really think we need better signals and more infrastructure, really, to make it go better and faster and more buses. So yeah, communication with the MBTA, I think, will be very important.
Yep. And as part of Clarendon Residents United, what common concerns do the residents at Clarendon bring up?
Oh, definitely. Just crossing the street. We live right off Alewife Parkway, which is so heavy during rush hour. We are dealing with the reconstruction, and one of the biggest topics they brought up was actually putting an overpass type thing. So it's a lot safer crossing the street, because though they have this stoplight, it's still really hectic and crazy. I'm terrified just to walk across the street, and there's a park. We live by I think Dilboy, I believe, and so there's all this fun stuff over there, but it's so kind of scary just to cross the street. We also have the Stop and Shop right over here, and I know I always see the kids running around, so I think for most parents it's really about their kids getting around safely. And just older people, it's everybody. We don't want to accidentally have an accident, and I've literally had accidents right outside my window. We have an intersection here, and it's just crazy hectic at rush hour. You don't want to, I don't know how people deal with it with their kids all the time. So I think that's the big one, their children getting around here, because we have the school too. That's right, we live right next to West Neighborhood School. So safety is the #1 priority, I think, here with the kids.
Yeah, Thank you for sharing that point of view. Next, we'll talk to Leon about his experiences. So what are things about using your streets and sidewalks that are dangerous for you, but overlooked by others?
So the biggest thing for me personally would be flashing lights. So I have a sensory processing disorder, which the 2-second explanation for anyone unfamiliar, sensory processing disorders, which are commonly but not exclusively associated with autism, are when someone experiences sensory inputs particularly intensely. And one of the most common things that causes a lot of problems for people is flashing lights. But a lot of other people aren't aware of this, and they tend to show up on safety systems all the time, which makes it really hard for me to get around the streets. Something like I'll see signs that are surrounded with a border of blinking lights. I assume to make them more obvious and visible, but if I come across one of those, I can't look at it for long enough to actually read what the sign says. Cyclists will use flashing headlights to try to make themselves more obvious to cars, but if one of them comes up behind me while I'm riding, I have to pull off to the side of the street and cover my eyes until they're past me. The times that I've been most worried that I would get hurt while riding haven't involved cars, they haven't involved poor road conditions. They've been when I've come across the warning lights at a railroad crossing or a mid-block crosswalk have come on suddenly and startled me so much that I nearly crashed. And so like I want to be excited when I see new systems put into place trying to make the streets safer, but it's really hard to actually feel good about that when the systems are actually making the roads less safe for me.
Oh, that's good to know. What is the #1 change the city could implement to make getting around safer for you?
I think just having more people and a wider variety of people involved at the planning stage. Don't assume that the people in charge of a design will be able to anticipate all the different ways it could affect people. No one person can. So give as many different people from as many different demographics a chance to review it before it's implemented so that any problems like this can be pointed out when it's just changing the design on paper and not having to completely rebuild everything that's already in place.
Okay, and you've been heavily involved with the Mayor's Commission for Persons with Disabilities. What are other common things that you hear from people in those groups?
So when a lot of people, especially outside of the disability community, think about accessibility, what they tend to have in mind is wheelchair accessibility. So they might recognize problems like an obstructed sidewalk or a blocked curb cut. Disability is a lot more varied than that. So are the barriers that disabled people have to getting around the city. So for example, a big problem for blind people is whether they will be able to safely cross the street. Availability of shade and seating came up in the climate section, but is also an accessibility issue for people who can't walk for very long, people who are particularly sensitive to heat and sunlight. So having more shade and more places to sit, both at bus stops, but also just periodically along thoroughfares that have high pedestrian traffic, so that if someone's trying to walk down Beacon Street, they don't have to walk the entire length before they can stop. Another thing, many people will just be used to tuning out the background noise of a street, but that can actually be a safety issue for someone who is hard of hearing or with an auditory processing disorder, since it makes it harder to identify individual sounds that might indicate something like a car coming up behind them. And then another one is ride shares have a lot of accessibility issues, and thus so does any system that is built on the assumption that people will have that as an option for how they get around, because a lot of drivers won't pick up passengers who have a wheelchair or a service animal. So this is just barely scratching the surface, but hopefully starts to give an idea of the breadth of access needs we need to keep in mind as we work to make the streets safer and more usable for everybody.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Steph. Steph, how do you normally get around, and what are things about using our streets and sidewalks that are dangerous for you but overlooked by others?
Sure enough. My apologies with everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm still trying to get used to this Zoom world, and nothing's gonna go right with that. So, but my main mode of transport is I try to walk around as much as possible in Somerville. Obviously, ride sharing is another option that I use a lot, and taking the bus as much as possible.
And you walk around with a cane, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And so what are things about using our streets and sidewalks that make it hard for you to get around that way?
Well, obviously with Boston and the greater Boston area, they are a very historical city, so they tend to hold on to a lot of their things. So we have higher curbs than most, and so that makes it a little bit difficult, crossing the streets safely. But we're trying our best. And
Okay, great. What is the #1 change the city could implement to make getting around safer for you?
well, obviously dedicating to fixing the sidewalks as best as possible. Obviously, some of the trees have uplifted some of the sidewalks, and so it makes it a little bit difficult walking through there. But I'm so happy that the earth is, that the city is very cautious about our environment. So, displacing those trees, I wouldn't want to see done, but I'm trying to improve the sidewalks would be excellent.
Thank you. And I guess, how does snow affect your walking, getting around?
With snow, it's extremely tricky. Luckily, there's bike lanes, so if you want to step off the sidewalk and use a bike lane, I think that would be the best opportunity. So hopefully residents are able to clean up this in front of their houses as best as possible. Actually, I think we did a great effort, and some of them are trying to do that. So shout out to all the residents for shoveling your snow so people like me can get through. Thank you. Much appreciated.
So you were formerly part of the Mystic Tenant Association.
Yes.
What were common concerns? I know Mystic is kind of a crazy street as well.
Yes. So for 4 years, I did serve the city. I did serve the Mystic development as their tenant president. And we had a lot of concerns with Mystic Ave. Obviously, Mystic Ave is about half a mile long, but it deals with a lot of the traffic that comes through our city. And right next to it is at 93. So we definitely had issues getting people safely to Assembly Row after it opened up. And then getting our families down to Stop and Shop safely has been difficult as well. So actually, some parents don't even let their children walk down Mystic Ave to get to Stop and Shop. They send them up Temple Street and walk down Broadway because, obviously with Mystic Ave being a state road, it's difficult to get that changed up. But we appreciate everything that our elected officials have been able to do to improve that.
Thank you for sharing that. Next, we're going to move to Susan. Susan, how do you normally get around Somerville, and what are things about using our streets and sidewalks that are dangerous for you but overlooked by others?
I usually bike, but I also do have a car, so I occasionally take the car if I need to carry something big. We need to make more room on our streets for bikes so that they're safer and more inviting to bikers. I don't think these are especially particular to me, but these are general ideas I have that I want to see happen. So that will make streets better for young bikers and new bikers. And this means we need to get streets, we need to get cars off the side of the streets. We need less on-street parking. That way we'd have room for 2 bike lanes in each direction. And what do we do with those cars? Well, there are a lot of unused driveways in many neighborhoods of Somerville. And if it weren't so easy to park on the street, people would use driveways more. They could use side streets, and the city could do various things to encourage people to use their driveways more. We need to get creative about what to do with cars. For instance, there's space overnight in the Harvard Vanguard parking lot here in Davis Square that could be opened up for neighbors at night. But the city doesn't have to always prioritize the convenience of car owners. If it were less convenient to own a car in Somerville, we'd have less cars in Somerville, and that would be a good thing for the city. Holland Street is being redone soon, and there's not much that's been done to make it safer for bikes. And they're planning on repaving College Ave And again, little provision for bike lanes in that plan. Davis Square has close to the highest bicycle crash rate in the city, and College Ave was the location for a pedestrian death recently. It would also be helpful if potholes were fixed faster. That's good for new riders, but also anyone. And I think we should make the speed limit for the whole city be 20 miles an hour, not just around schools. Speed kills. And aside from lowering the speed limit, we need to enforce it and publicize it. 80% of the cars in the traffic flow in Somerville are just passing through, and a lower speed limit might encourage some of those cars to find a different route. We need to use the recommendations of all the visioning studies that we've done. Vision Zero Action Plan, Summer Vision 2040, the Climate Forward Plan, all these things. It's great to have meetings and come up with plans, but the hard part is putting them into practice, and that's what really matters. I'm very proud to know that 9% of Somerville commuters get to work by bike, and that makes us the #5 city in this regard in the country. One strange thing about Davis Square here is that if you're standing at the corner of Dover and Holland, you can see that cars are coming with green lights from two directions. They would run into each other if they didn't watch out. They just have to figure out who's going to go first. What's the point of having traffic lights if it's really a free-for-all? I called the city about that one time and they said, well, there are 5 streets that come into Davis Square, so that's what we decided. Doesn't make any sense to me. As far as feedback as a pedestrian, I agree that we need to do more to get the sidewalks shoveled. A lot of people do what they should, but seems like on each block there's one house that just doesn't shovel, and I don't think it's fair. I think it'd be great if we could find city money to have the main thoroughfares sidewalks plowed like we do in the big squares. But even assuming that isn't going to happen, having enforcement of that rule so that if someone doesn't shovel or find someone to shovel for them, something happens to them. And people need to shovel all the way to the road. You can't just shovel and then leave a big mountain for people to climb over to get to the road. That's ridiculous. The mayor often says that he wants to make Somerville the #1 biking city in the country, and we do a lot to encourage people to ride in Somerville, and I certainly do this in my bike school. But with so many streets that are unsafe for biking, doesn't encouraging people to bike set them up for injury or worse? We have to prioritize our vulnerable road users, bikers, pedestrians, anyone that's not in a motor vehicle, so that we can all get around the city safely and enjoyably.
Great. So you listed a lot of things there. What is the #1 change that you want to see the city do?
I guess my #1 ask would be more bike lanes.
Great, thanks. And so these are, thank you for everybody for sharing your point of view. And I will say that one last question for everybody going around. Where in Somerville would you go more often if you felt safe getting there or hanging out there? I will start by saying that I don't go to Highland as often as I should, because from East Somerville, it's not the easiest to get there. I have to take some detours. I have to walk under McGrath or over McGrath. And so it's not the most pleasant way to get there. Larry, where would you go?
Yeah, for me, it's Assembly. I mean, I think we're tragically aware of how difficult it is to get there as a pedestrian. I know there have been some improvements, but I tried to do it recently, and it's still nerve-wracking. I feel like it's easier to get there by transit if you live in Boston as well, instead of West Somerville. It takes the 90 bus is like an hour between buses, so it's not particularly viable.
Letitia, where would you go in Somerville?
This pretty much the same as what he just said. I would love to feel safer going to East Somerville, in the Assembly area. It just, like you said, there's lack of buses to get over there, and I've always felt not safe over there, especially because Sullivan is over there as well. I've never felt comfortable going. So yeah. I would like to see some more stuff implemented to change that.
Leanne, where would you go?
So for me, it's not so much a specific location, but that I would love to do more of my shopping locally instead of online, but it's so exhausting getting to the stores that I don't. So that would be a wonderful change. And I also would just spend more time biking for exercise or for pleasure instead of solely as a means of getting from one place to another.
Great. Steph, where would you go if Somerville made it nicer to get around?
Yeah, so just reiterate what a couple other people had said. I would love to get to Assembly Row a little bit safer. I mean, I appreciate all the personal questions about me getting around and how I get around, but actually I'm here for the people. And I think that the 1,400 residents that live in Mystic Ave and almost 10,000 residents that live on Mystic Ave altogether, I think that we should try to get that a little bit safer for them so that they can actually enjoy Assembly Row. It's an awesome place to go shopping.
It's great. And Susan, where would you go?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer this question. I guess I'll answer it for my students who tell me that they would love to be able to ride through Davis Square comfortably. It's a really nice place to go, but being so with such narrow roads, new riders don't feel comfortable there, and it's not safe for even experienced riders.
Great, thank you everybody for sharing your points of views, and I hope the audience found this very enlightening and interesting information. Next, I'm going to pass on to Bonnie to kind of close us out.
Hi, thank you to all of the previous people who've spoken. I agree with so much of what you've said and really appreciate it. My name is Bonnie Dennis. I am the chair of the Mayor's Commission for Persons with Disabilities, though today I'll be speaking as a private resident. I want to acknowledge as well some of the fantastic questions that have come in through the chat, and many of them are related to accessibility, which is primarily what I'm going to be speaking about today. In SASS, we believe that none of us are truly safe until all of us are safe, and that our streets should provide equitable mobility for all residents. I have lived in Somerville for the majority of the last 20 years because of the people, the abundance of the arts, and all of the amazing businesses. I've lived in many different neighborhoods and seen dramatic differences in safety and equity. That small section of Boston Ave that's one way towards Morrison, where it was protected enough that I wasn't constantly worried about traffic. Paulina Street, with easy access to a playground, many trees, and easy access to many transit options. Brick Bottom, with very few sidewalks and curb cuts. Right on Powderhouse Boulevard, where the good sidewalks were overshadowed by the frequent crashes at the intersection facing my house. And now I live at Maxwell's Green. It has really convenient access to the community path. And when I became a nearly full-time wheelchair user, I chose this building thinking it would give me convenient, accessible ways to get so many places I love without the need to use my car. Often I find myself only going out when I have friends to help in case I run into roadblocks. I usually avoid Gilman Square because the steep hill from Maxwell's Green, the many obstacles on the sidewalks, and the stairs in and around most buildings leave little value for me. When I use the community path, I find myself turning around when I reach the Rite Aid parking lot in sight of Davis, because going further makes me see constant reminders that inclusion is too often a poorly executed afterthought. A piece of plywood for a wheelchair ramp with a bike blocking it would be great in a skate park. In terms of my safety as a wheelchair user, not so much. And some of the obstructions are more subtle, but no less depressing. Last spring, the city was full of businesses with cones, flower pots, and other barriers that claimed large swaths of the sidewalks for their customers to line up, forcing passersby to struggle to get past. Now, I love how quickly everyone's been able to adapt and find ways to stay afloat and keep some of the community thriving, but it needs to be done with care to not push part of the community out in the process. It can be hard to notice when we don't have personal experience. We all have something to draw from. Imagine trying to get down a narrow path, pushing a stroller, or carrying a big package. or the feeling of being on a bicycle and being squeezed between parked cars and traffic. Or think about the familiar winter problem of lack of snow removal that stops us all. We know the problems with the lack of protection. Bicyclists have to be on guard constantly, pushed into narrow, unsafe spaces, wondering when they might be stopped in their tracks. And it doesn't have to be this way. We believe that everyone should and can benefit from our public space. Universal design creates better streets for everyone. Making sure bike lane design accommodates pedestrians who are older or who have disabilities is not about designing streets for a special interest group. Design that meets the needs of one group often enhances streets for the needs of others. Curb ramps were designed by wheelchair users, but they also benefit many others, including families with strollers, seniors with shopping carts, people walking their bikes, and delivery people using dollies. Finding solutions that meet the needs of 100% of the population is sometimes impossible, but designing the most inclusive, boundary-pushing streetscapes that do not compromise safety for any user should always be the goal. Now, Somerville residents have participated in the Vision Zero Action Plan, Summer Vision, the Climate Forward Plan, the Open Space Task Force Strategy, and the Parking Task Force recommendations. But the city is not consistently implementing these plans. We at SASS have developed a draft set of recommendations, some of which I'll highlight, but we look forward to gathering more input from the community, and we encourage you to read these further. We call on the mayor to dedicate resources in the 2022 budget for the rapid construction of physical infrastructure that will slow traffic, protect residents, bring our city's streets and sidewalks into compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and prevent further traffic fatalities. We specifically ask the mayor to fund the creation of a Department of Transportation with at least 3 new additional full-time staff, including a senior position empowered to coordinate this work across departments, which we like to think of as a chief of streets. We'd like the mayor to direct the directors of mobility, engineering, public works, traffic, and parking to collaborate with each other and the community to implement effective, legal, and equitable measures that will slow drivers and save lives. We call on the city councilors to support safe streets and equitable mobility items in the 2022 budget, and to support the administration's recent fiscal year 2021 request for additional full-time staff in the mobility division, to insist on the formation of the oversight committee that is called for in the city's Vision Zero plan, and to use all the power at its disposal to ensure that proposed streetscape projects align with the city's stated goals. We further call on the city to prioritize the safety of vulnerable road users over the desires of motorists, to discourage speeding by lowering the citywide speed limit to 20 miles per hour and implement measures to slow drivers and save lives, to enact parking reform to incentivize people to own fewer cars, free up areas of the public way for other uses, and enhance safety of vulnerable road users, and to prioritize the movement of people by bus by creating more dedicated bus lanes and building more bus shelters on arterial routes. We call on our fellow Somerville residents to stand on common ground and join us in this mission to create a safer and more livable city, to educate yourself on common safety and accessibility issues so you can more effectively advocate, and to write and call your local elected officials or speak up in public meetings when there are issues related to safety and accessibility. Now, there are some small actions we can take to support our neighbors, like clearing an extra block of snow or a curb cut if you're able, or utilizing 311 to report dangerous spots you see. Pushing trash and recycling bins out of the pedestrian path after they're emptied, and helping business owners you know with education on disability access so we can be allies. Speak up when you notice the lack of ramps or the lack of clearance between tables. SASS isn't going away. We're prepared to keep advocating for safety and to support our community. Some of the ways we'll do that are to provide open forums to keep all residents informed, to organize direct actions to raise awareness of the urgent need to create safe and accessible public streets and sidewalks, to develop and publicly track specific metrics to evaluate both the success and failure of the city's efforts, and to mobilize Somerville residents to make their voices heard in emails, calls, and letters to their elected officials, and to attend and participate in public meetings. We know the work of moving towards a safer, more just city will be a challenge. Our goal is to move beyond defensiveness and to action. Too often we're pitted against each other and we get entrenched in our own views. But this declaration had over 400 people sign, and this summit I see over 150 people of you showed up today. So we know that it doesn't need to be that way. When we're all willing to learn and work together, the city administration, city councilors, and constituents, and evaluate our habits and approaches, we can make changes that will improve Somerville for everyone. Sign the declaration if you haven't, send it to a few friends if you have, like our Facebook page, connect with us via email. We really want to keep this conversation going. Thank you so much for coming together today. We look forward to working together.